Why would you ever trust a piece of paper in your wallet? I mean, really trust it. We accept that a $20 bill has value because a government says it does, because a system of intricate designs and secret threads tells us it's real. But what happens when someone decides to play that system, not from the outside as a clumsy forger, but from within its own rulebook? What does that tell us about where real value actually comes from? A few years ago, a man from a small city in Quebec decided to find out, and in the process, he printed $250 million. His name is Frank Bourassa, and his story is less about crime and more about a very uncomfortable question. What is the one thing that makes his money fake and ours real? Before we begin, this video is an educational and analytical discussion of a documented criminal case and its broader implications. It reflects analysis and opinion based on publicly available information and does not promote or glorify illegal activity. I am not offering financial or legal advice. This is a story about systems, psychology, and the very idea of value. So let's establish what we're talking about. In the late 2000s, a Canadian man named Frank Bourassa, using a combination of publicly available information, industrial equipment, and sheer audacity, orchestrated what is recognized as the largest counterfeiting operation ever conducted by a single individual. He didn't just print a few bad bills in a basement. He produced an estimated $250 million in United States $20 bills. That's 12.5 million individual notes. The operation was shockingly sophisticated. Bourassa didn't just try to copy the look of money. He reverse engineered its very substance. His first and biggest hurdle was the paper. Real U.S. currency is printed on a specific proprietary blend of cotton and linen. So Bourassa, posing as a legitimate businessman, contacted paper mills across Europe. He eventually convinced a mill in Germany to produce this special paper for him, even having them embed the correct security thread and a watermark of Andrew Jackson's face during the manufacturing process. The shipment arrived at the port of Montreal in late 2009. Bourassa has described surveilling the port for days, certain the police would swoop in. When they didn't and his crew retrieved the pallets, he said it was the best day of his life. He knew he was, in his words, filthy rich. He'd cleared the single greatest obstacle. He then invested over $100,000 in a professional-grade offset printing press, cutters, and other equipment, setting up a full print shop in a garage rented from a farmer who asked no questions. The total startup cost was around 325,000 Canadian dollars, funded from his past business and previous involvement in the illegal marijuana trade. For months, he worked 16-hour days, turning that blank yet already secured paper into stacks of 20s. The result was, by all accounts, terrifyingly good. He perfected the inks, the peach and green hues. He added the final details, even ensuring the serial numbers on the bills were non-sequential, a sophisticated touch that made them harder to track. When the Royal Canadian Mounted Police later seized some of the notes, they described them as virtually undetectable to the naked eye, noting they even felt identical to real currency. Bourassa's business model was wholesale. He sold these counterfeit notes to criminal networks, primarily overseas in Europe, Asia, and Africa. During an interview with Business Insider, Frank said that most buyers did not begin with massive purchases. Instead, they typically started with what he described as small trial orders, usually around $100,000, just to see whether the notes would pass scrutiny. Once they felt confident in the quality, they increased their request to roughly $250,000 and later to $500,000. And eventually, after becoming convinced that the counterfeits were convincing enough to circulate without immediate suspicion, some customers began placing orders as large as $1 million at a time. Throughout this entire process, Bourassa priced the notes at about 30% of their stated face value. He managed to sell approximately $50 million of his stock this way, but the scale was his undoing. Needing to move more product, he took on a new client. That client, however, had already been compromised. He was selling stolen heavy goods to an undercover police officer. When that client asked the undercover officer if he'd like to buy some counterfeit money, the trap was set. The undercover police officer placed an order for $100,000. The next day, supposedly thrilled with the first batch, he ordered the same again. On May 23, 2012, the police raided Bourassa's girlfriend's home, found $949,000 in counterfeit notes and the printing plates, and arrested him. Facing the possibility of extradition to the United States and decades in prison, Bourassa played his ultimate card. He revealed the location of his remaining inventory, approximately $200 million in uncirculated counterfeit cash. He handed it all over. In a stunning conclusion, he served just 6 weeks in prison, paid a small fine, and walked free. Today, he runs a security consultancy, ironically advising companies on how to avoid being counterfeited. How did one man, working largely alone, penetrate layers of state security meant to be impenetrable? And what does his relatively minor punishment say about how the system values the threat he represented? Bourassa's method wasn't brute force. It was strategic exploitation of gaps he identified in the system. Let's break down his approach because it reads less like a crime spree and more like a hostile audit of the global financial system. First, his target selection was coldly logical. He chose the US dollar not out of malice, but because it is the world's most accepted reserve currency. He chose the $20 bill specifically because, at that time, it was a workhorse denomination, circulated heavily, checked less meticulously than 100, and crucially, it had older, weaker security features compared to newer bills like the 10 or the 5. He wasn't attacking the strongest point of the fortress. He found a slightly older, heavily trafficked gate. He has said in interviews that he started on the official U.S. government currency education websites, which meticulously detail every security feature meant to stop people like him. Think about that for a second. He used the defender's own manual to plan his attack. This wasn't a secret black market playbook, it was public information. This shifts the narrative. It suggests that part of security's weakness is the inherent tension between educating the public to spot fakes and providing a blueprint for the determined replicator. But the masterstroke was the paper. By going directly to a European mill and having them weave in the security features during production, he effectively outsourced the most difficult part of counterfeiting to a legitimate industrial partner who was utterly duped. He didn't try to add a security thread to existing paper. He had the thread made into the paper. This inverted the entire challenge. It exposes a vulnerability we don't think about, the globalized supply chain. The security of a national currency, in this case, hinged on the due diligence of a paper mill manager in another country, evaluating an order from what they believe was an investment firm. Which brings me to the most perplexing part of this story, the outcome. Frank Bourassa, who produced an ocean of fake currency that could have theoretically destabilized chunks of the economy, served 6 weeks. 6 weeks. You can get more time for serious tax evasion. So what happened? This is where we have to think like the authorities. From their perspective, what was the primary threat? It was those $200 million still in storage, a tidal wave of fake money that could hit the streets at any moment. Bourassa, through his lawyer, offered a deal. He gives them the entire inventory and they let him go. They took it. On one level, it's a pragmatic trade. They eliminated the physical threat instantly and completely. Prosecuting him to the fullest extent would have been a long, expensive process with an uncertain jury outcome, and it wouldn't have made that mountain of paper disappear. They prioritize system stability over punitive justice. But on another level, it reveals a fascinating, almost philosophical hierarchy of fear. The system seemed more afraid of the existence of the perfect fake than the person who created it. By turning in the notes, Bourassa wasn't just giving up evidence. He was giving back the illusion of control. The moment that paper was in police custody, it transformed from an active economic weapon back into a passive, controlled piece of evidence. His freedom was the price for restoring that boundary. So Bourassa walks away, and the immediate crisis is averted. But the echoes of his operation force us to look at wider, shakier ground. His story isn't an isolated incident. It's an extreme example of a fundamental tension in any system based on trust. The official narrative is clearly one of success. A major threat was neutralized. $250 million in high-quality counterfeit currency was seized before it could flood markets. The bad guy is no longer in business. That's the win column. But you have to look at the trade-offs. To get that win, authorities had to let the architect of the scheme, a man who showed contempt for the entire system, walk away with what he claims was $15 million in real profit. They also publicly validated the stunning quality of his work, with police describing it as some of the best they'd ever seen. So what does Bourassa's success tell us about the vulnerabilities of the US dollar itself? He was shockingly blunt about this, telling ABC News that US bills were the easiest of them all to counterfeit because they're still on paper, while many other countries had moved to more secure polymer notes. He exploited a specific known vulnerability, the older design $20 bill, by using publicly available information. His story is less about a genius hacker and more about a determined individual applying industrial-scale problem-solving to a system that had, in one particular area, become static. The Secret Service updates its features, but currency circulates for decades. A bill designed in 2003 was, by the late 2000s, a known entity, its secrets laid bare on the internet. Bourassa didn't attack the fortress at its strongest point. He found a side door that had been left cataloged and described, and he built a key. Frank Bourassa today runs a security consulting firm. He's the poacher turned gamekeeper, using his unique knowledge to help protect systems. There's a neat, almost poetic symmetry to that, but I think his legacy is more complicated. His case likely led to tightened protocols, both in currency design, we've seen continual security upgrades, and in monitoring specialty industrial supply chains. The response to a breach is always to fortify the physical barriers. But I keep coming back to the human element. Bourassa wasn't a state actor or a terrorist. He was, by his own account, an entrepreneur who found the legitimate world too exhausting and chose a different path. His incentive was personal profit, not systemic collapse, and the system's response was ultimately a transactional negotiation, not a moral crusade. This, to me, is the most realistic lesson. We build these immense, complex systems of trust, financial markets, currencies, even nations. We surround them with layers of physical and digital security. But at the edges, they are always vulnerable to the ingenuity, the audacity, or the desperation of a single individual who decides to play by a different set of rules. The defense is not just better ink or smarter threads. It's a constant vigilant renewal of the shared belief that holds the system together. Because Bourassa proved that if you look closely enough, the biggest wall protecting the vault might just be an idea we all agree to believe in. If you found this analysis of trust, value, and the lines we draw between real and fake interesting, I'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button, share it with someone who enjoys these deep dives, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss the next exploration. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.